The Wyoming Territory, 1885, where a man's worth was measured in acres and cattle heads, where fortunes rose and fell with the unpredictable seasons, and where bloodlines and breeding meant everything until they meant nothing at all. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The endless prairies of Wyoming stretched like a golden ocean beneath. The vast blue sky, an empire of grass and promise that had transformed hardy pioneers into cattle kings. The Whispering Pines Ranch stood as the undisputed jewel of the territory. 20,000 head of cattle grazing across 50,000 acres of the finest grazing land the West had ever known. 300 cowboys and one man whose name commanded respect and envy wherever it was spoken, Jackson Montgomery. The late afternoon wind stirred dust devils across the main street of Silver Creek as Jackson's stallion thundered through town, its powerful hooves drumming against the hard-packed earth. Townspeople stepped aside, nodding respectfully or tipping their hats. Women paused their errands, eyes following the commanding figure astride the impressive chestnut horse. At 35, Jackson Montgomery had the kind of presence that quieted saloons and cleared boardwalks, not from friendliness, but from the calm, uncompromising authority that surrounded him like the dust from his horse's hooves. The Montgomery ranch house stood proudly atop the highest ridge overlooking their vast holdings, a symbol of 3 generations of cattle breeding and relentless expansion. The grand white house, with its wide verandas and tall windows, caught the reddening rays of the setting sun, transforming ordinary wood and paint into something almost regal. As Jackson dismounted, handing the reins to a waiting stable hand, his father appeared on the front steps. Emmett Montgomery stood like a weathered oak in the doorway, diminished in stature by age, but undimmed in presence. At 70, with a shock of white hair and piercing blue eyes, he remained the true power behind the Whispering Pines empire. He watched his son approach, noting the tension in the younger man's shoulders, the firm set of his jaw that signaled concern and hard decisions. "Jackson," Emmett said with a curt nod, "didn't expect you back from Cheyenne until tomorrow." Jackson removed his riding gloves with practiced efficiency. "Plans change. We need to talk." The study was Emmett's sanctuary, a kingdom of leather-bound ledgers, maps of grazing territories, and the persistent aroma of fine cigars. A massive mahogany desk dominated the room, its surface buried beneath cattle records and land purchase agreements. Emmett didn't sit. Instead, he poured 2 fingers of whiskey into a crystal tumbler and took a substantial swallow before facing his son. "The northern pastures are drying up," Emmett stated without preamble. "3rd month without decent rain." Jackson's brow furrowed. "That can't be right. The almanac predicted. Almanacs lie. Dead grass doesn't." Emmett slid a report across the desk. "We're losing weight on the herd daily, and the railroad contracts won't wait." Jackson scanned the figures, the severity of their situation becoming clear like a distant storm rolling closer. "We can drive the herd south toward the Medicine Bow Range. There's still water there." "No." Emmett's voice cracked like a whip. "Montgomerys don't retreat. We expand." "With what water?" Jackson asked, keeping his voice steady despite the frustration building in his chest. "Unless you found a river you haven't told me about." A smile that wasn't quite a smile crossed Emmett's weathered face. "Better. I found a solution." From inside his vest, Emmett withdrew an envelope sealed with wax and placed it deliberately on the desk between them. Jackson made no move to take it. "What is this?" "Your future," Emmett replied, "and the future of everything we've built." Jackson's fingers felt oddly heavy as he broke the seal and unfolded the document inside. Formal language, precise and binding, swam before his eyes until the purpose became unmistakably clear. a marriage contract. To whom? Jackson looked up, disbelief etched across his features. Abigail Callahan. The name hung in the air between them, familiar yet unexpected. Jackson searched his memory. The Callahans owned a modest farm near Silver Creek, growing wheat and corn on lands that bordered Montgomery grazing territory to the east. Simple farmers with a reputation for honest dealings, but nothing remarkable. The Callahan farm sits directly above the largest underground spring in the territory, Emmett continued, reading Jackson's thoughts. Their last 3 wells produced water even during the worst droughts we've seen. With their water rights and our cattle. He trailed off, the calculation evident. And the daughter? Jackson asked, his voice deliberately neutral. What do we know of her? Emmett waved dismissively. She's of marriageable age, educated sufficiently for running a household, keeps to herself mostly, helps her mother since her father passed last year. That's not what I meant. I know what you meant. Emmett's eyes hardened. This isn't about courtship or sentiment, Jackson. This is survival. This is securing the Montgomery legacy. Jackson placed the contract back on the desk, fighting to keep his breathing measured. And if I refuse? Emmett didn't answer immediately. He walked to the window, gazing out at the empire he had expanded from the modest ranch his own father had established. The vast herds visible as dark specks against the grasslands, the buildings that housed their operations, and the men who made it possible. Then you choose to watch everything 3 generations of Montgomerys have built turn to dust and blow away. He turned back to face his son. Is your pride worth that price? The silence stretched between them, taut as a lariat. When? Jackson finally asked. Saturday. Judge Hollister will conduct the ceremony here, Emmett added as an afterthought. The mother insisted on a small family affair. Apparently the girl is reserved. Something in his father's tone made Jackson look up sharply. What aren't you telling me? Emmett sighed, a rare display of hesitation. There are rumors about the Callahan girl. Nothing that affects our arrangement. What kind of rumors? The kind that explain why she's rarely seen in town despite being of marriageable age for several years now. Emmett's expression remained impassive. They say she suffered an injury as a child, left her with a pronounced limp, nothing that should affect her ability to manage a household or bear children. Jackson felt a cold weight settle in his stomach despite the warmth of the room. So I'm to marry a crippled stranger because we've had a dry season. You're to marry a woman with access to water, Emmett corrected, his patience visibly thinning. Her gait is immaterial to the arrangement. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Need I remind you that marriages of convenience have built empires since civilization began? Your mother and I had a business arrangement that became a partnership, based on mutual respect, if not passion, Jackson interrupted. And you can have the same, Emmett said. Beauty fades, cattle remain. Later that night, Jackson stood on the wide veranda, watching the distant flicker of lanterns where his night riders kept watch over the valuable herds. The air was cool, carrying the scent of sage and dust. His mind circled endlessly around thoughts of Abigail Callahan, a woman he had glimpsed perhaps twice in town, whose face he could barely recall, who would soon be bound to him by law and contract, if not by choice. What kind of woman was she? Did she resent this arrangement as much as he did, or was she perhaps grateful for the security it offered? The questions multiplied like stars appearing in the darkening sky, unanswerable and constant. A soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Mrs. Winslow, the housekeeper who had managed the Montgomery household since Jackson's mother died 15 years ago, entered with a steaming cup of coffee. "Thought you might need this," she said, setting the cup on the small table. Your father told me the news. Jackson smiled wryly. News travels fast in this house. Like wildfire, Mrs. Winslow agreed. Her lined face was sympathetic but practical. It's not what you wanted. No, Jackson admitted, it's not. Mrs. Winslow poured the coffee, adding the splash of whiskey she knew he preferred on difficult nights. I knew Margaret Callahan before her husband passed. Good people, the Callahans, plain-spoken but decent. Jackson couldn't help asking, "What do you know of the daughter?" Mrs. Winslow's eyes grew distant with memory. Sweet child, clever with numbers from what I hear, used to help her father with the farm accounts, even as a young girl. Jackson hesitated, searching for a delicate way to phrase his question. And her condition? Mrs. Winslow's expression tightened. Gossip is rarely kind, especially about those who are different. Yes, she walks with difficulty. Fell from a hayloft when she was 10, but difficulty walking doesn't reflect on character or intelligence. Jackson nodded, accepting both the coffee and the gentle rebuke. Thank you, Mrs. Winslow. After she left, Jackson returned to the veranda, coffee in hand. Tomorrow, he would ride to the Callahan farm. Propriety demanded at least one meeting before the ceremony, though the outcome was predetermined. The night spread out before him, vast and uncompromising as his father's ambition. Somewhere miles away, he wondered if Abigail Callahan was similarly sleepless, similarly trapped by circumstance and obligation. Dawn broke clear and harsh over the Wyoming plains as Jackson readied his horse for the journey to the Callahan farm. The property lay 15 miles east, situated on land that had once been considered too poor for grazing, but had proven surprisingly productive for crops. "Remember your manners," Emmett said, as Jackson mounted his horse. It wasn't concern in the older man's voice, but strategy. The agreement is favorable, but not yet signed. We need the Callahan woman's final approval. Jackson nodded curtly. I know how to conduct business, father. This isn't just business, Emmett replied. It's your future, our future. The ride to the Callahan farm gave Jackson time to order his thoughts. His initial resentment had cooled into resignation. He was his father's son, after all, practical when necessary, strategic always. If this marriage would secure the Montgomery legacy, then he would approach it as he did every challenge, with clear eyes and careful planning. As he crested the final rise, Jackson was surprised by the Callahan property spread out below him. He had expected a modest farmhouse and perhaps a few cultivated fields. Instead, he found himself looking at a well-organized operation. Neat fields stretching to the horizon, a substantial barn, grain silos, and a surprisingly handsome two-story farmhouse with a wide porch wrapping around 3 sides. Everything appeared meticulously maintained, from the whitewashed fences to the carefully laid-out vegetable gardens. This was not the struggling family farm he had imagined, but a well-managed agricultural enterprise. Jackson was expected. A young stable hand took his horse, and a maid in a crisp apron showed him into a parlor furnished with pieces that reflected quiet prosperity. Quality furniture, not ostentatious but well-crafted and cared for, created an atmosphere of comfortable dignity. The room was bright and airy, with large windows that allowed the morning light to flood the space. Margaret Callahan entered first, a woman in her early 50s, with auburn hair now threaded with silver and a posture that spoke of quiet determination. Her greeting was polite, but measured. "Mr. Montgomery," she said, extending her hand. "You're punctual, a quality I appreciate." "Mrs. Callahan." Jackson bowed slightly. "Thank you for receiving me. Please sit." She gestured to a chair across from a settee. "My daughter will join us shortly." An awkward silence descended. Jackson searched for an appropriate opening. "I was sorry to hear of your husband's passing," he finally said. "My father spoke highly of his integrity." A fleeting expression crossed Margaret's face. Surprise, perhaps, or skepticism. Did he? They were more often competitors than allies, as I recall. Business and respect are not mutually exclusive, Jackson replied evenly. Margaret studied him with shrewd eyes. No, they are not, though they are often sacrificed in pursuit of profit. Before Jackson could respond, the parlor door opened again. He rose automatically, turning to face the woman who would soon be his wife. Abigail Callahan entered the room like someone accustomed to being noticed, but wishing otherwise, quietly, efficiently, with purpose, but without drawing attention. She was of medium height, with a slender build that her simple blue dress complemented, rather than concealed. Her chestnut hair was arranged in a practical style that framed a face with clear, intelligent features and remarkably vivid green eyes. As she moved toward them, Jackson observed the limp that had been the subject of town gossip. Her right leg moved stiffly, causing an uneven gait that she managed with practiced dignity. It was noticeable but not dramatic, the result of an old injury, imperfectly healed, now incorporated into her natural movement. Jackson realized he was staring and immediately redirected his gaze to her face. Her eyes met his directly without shame or apology, but with a wariness that suggested she was accustomed to being an object of curiosity. "Mr. Montgomery," she said, her voice surprisingly melodious and self-possessed. "I believe you're here to inspect your investment." "Abigail," Margaret made a small sound of disapproval. "Forgive me, Mother," Abigail said without looking away from Jackson. "I meant no disrespect. I simply prefer clarity in business matters." "As do I," Jackson found himself saying, "though I had hoped we might become acquainted as people before discussing terms." A ghost of a smile touched Abigail's lips. "How diplomatic of you. Very well, Mr. Montgomery, what would you like to know about the woman you've agreed to marry, sight unseen?" The challenge in her voice was unmistakable. This was not a woman crushed by physical limitations or desperate for rescue. This was someone who had faced her reflection every morning and chosen to define herself beyond what others saw. "Everything you're willing to share," Jackson replied honestly. "I find I know surprisingly little about the person who will soon share my name." Abigail sat beside her mother, arranging her skirts with practiced precision. "I was educated at home, primarily by my father. I speak French and a little Spanish. I managed my father's accounts before his death and have overseen our farming operations since. I prefer sunrise to sunset, coffee to tea, and directness to pretense." She paused, then added, "Your turn, Mr. Montgomery." Despite himself, Jackson felt a smile tug at his lips. "I was educated at boarding school in Boston until I was 16, then returned to learn ranching from my father. I speak passable Spanish thanks to our Mexican cowboys. I've managed our cattle operation alongside my father since I was 20. I prefer whiskey to brandy, horses to carriages, and honesty to tact." "Well," Margaret said after a moment, "at least you'll have stimulating conversations." The tension in the room eased slightly. Coffee was served, and the discussion turned to practical matters, the details of the ceremony, the joining of their properties, and the logistics of water rights transfers. Throughout the conversation, Jackson found his attention repeatedly drawn to Abigail. She spoke with clarity and intelligence about agricultural yields, water management, and market fluctuations. There was no self-pity in her manner, no suggestion that she considered herself diminished by her circumstances or physical limitation. "The Eastern Well produces the most consistent flow," Abigail explained, spreading a property map on the table. "Between them, even during the drought of '79, it maintained output sufficient for our crops and could easily supplement your northern pastures. And with the Montgomery cattle having guaranteed water access," Jackson continued, studying the Map, we could increase the herd by 20% within the year. Precisely. Abigail met his gaze directly. A beneficial arrangement for both parties. Jackson found himself curious about her thoughts beyond the business at hand. And what of the personal arrangement, Miss Callahan? Does that concern you at all? Abigail's expression remained composed, but something flickered in her eyes. Caution, perhaps, or assessment. Marriage is a practical institution, Mr. Montgomery, she said carefully. Throughout history, it has secured alliances and consolidated resources more often than it has fulfilled romantic notions. I have no illusions about why this match has been proposed, nor any expectations beyond mutual respect and cooperation. Her answer was perfect, reasonable, mature, exactly what the situation called for. Yet Jackson sensed something beneath the practiced words, a depth of feeling carefully contained. And if I wished for more than cooperation? He found himself asking. Abigail's eyebrows rose slightly. Such as honesty, friendship perhaps in time. A small smile touched her lips, genuine this time. Honesty, I can promise immediately. Friendship. She tilted her head slightly. That would depend on what kind of man you prove to be. As Jackson prepared to leave, Abigail walked with him to the door while her mother remained in the parlor, giving them a moment of relative privacy. One more question, if I may, Jackson said, pausing at the threshold. Are you entering this arrangement willingly, Miss Callahan? Truly? Abigail considered him for a long moment, as if weighing not just her answer, but his worthiness to receive, her honesty. My options are limited, she finally said. Our farm prospers, but without my father's connections, our access to markets grows more tenuous each season. The Montgomerys can provide security and expanded opportunities. She straightened, her shoulders slightly. So, yes, I enter this arrangement willingly, with clear eyes and without resentment. She paused, studying his face. The question is, Mr. Montgomery, do you? Jackson was struck by her perception, her ability to see beyond social niceties, to the heart of the matter. My father has built his life around the Montgomery legacy, he said slowly. He sees this marriage as its salvation. That's not what I asked. Jackson met her steady gaze. I entered this arrangement because I understand duty and responsibility, whether I do so willingly. He paused. Let's say I do so with an open mind. Abigail nodded, accepting his honesty without judgment. Saturday, then. Saturday, he agreed, placing his hat on his head and stepping into the bright afternoon light. As he rode back toward Whispering Pines, Jackson found his thoughts returning, again and again, to Abigail Callahan. He had expected to meet a woman diminished by her circumstances, either bitter about her fate or pathetically grateful for the security his name offered. Instead, he had found someone with a clear-eyed understanding of her situation and the courage to face it without illusion. The limp, so striking at first observation, had somehow receded in his awareness as she spoke, as her intelligence and composure came to the fore. By the end of their meeting, he had found himself responding not to her physical limitation, but to her person, to the mind behind those direct green eyes. What kind of marriage could they build on such a foundation? Not love, perhaps, but something, potentially more enduring, respect, partnership, possibly even friendship. It was more than many marriages could claim, arranged or otherwise. As Whispering Pines appeared on the horizon, Jackson realized that while his future had been decided without his consent, the shape of that future might still hold surprises. Abigail Callahan was not what he had expected, and that, he decided, might be the one blessing in this business arrangement that now defined both their lives. The day of the wedding dawned clear and crisp. The Wyoming sky, an endless blue vault above the Montgomery ranch. Inside the main house, servants moved with practiced efficiency, arranging chairs in the garden, polishing silver that would gleam under the afternoon sun. The ceremony would be small, explained away as tasteful restraint rather than what it truly was, a hasty business transaction dressed in wedding clothes. Jackson stood at his bedroom window, watching the activity below with detached interest, as if observing a play in which he had been unexpectedly cast. His wedding suit hung, ready, charcoal gray with a silver waistcoat custom-made in Denver and delivered by express coach just yesterday. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Lucas Hayes, his foreman and closest friend, entered without waiting for an invitation, a liberty earned through years of shared work and mutual trust. "Quite a day," Lucas said, leaning against the doorframe. At 38, he had the weathered face of a man who spent his life under open skies, and the shrewd eyes of someone who saw more than he said. "Never thought I'd see you corralled," he added with a wry smile. Jackson gave a short laugh. "Nor I, yet here we are." Lucas studied his friend. "How bad is it? The drought, I mean." "Bad enough that my father is willing to broker his only son for water rights." Jackson turned from the window. "The northern pastures are dust. Without access to the Callahan Springs, we'd lose a third of the herd before winter." He left the sentence unfinished. "And the bride?" Lucas asked carefully. "You met her?" Jackson nodded, his expression thoughtful. "She's not what I expected." "The limp is exactly as rumored. She walks with difficulty," Jackson confirmed. "But that's not what I meant." Lucas raised an eyebrow, waiting. "She has a mind," Jackson said simply. "Sharp, practical, runs their farming operation with more skill than half the men in the territory could manage. Doesn't simper or apologize for her circumstances." "Sounds promising," Lucas offered. "For a partnership, at least." "Perhaps," Jackson straightened his shoulders. "What's certain is that by sundown, I'll be a married man, and the Montgomery-Callahan water agreement will begin implementation." Meanwhile, in the guest suite at the opposite end of the house, Abigail Callahan sat motionless as her mother secured the last pearl button on her wedding dress. The room was silent, save for the occasional direction. "Turn slightly, hold, still," as Margaret worked with the precision of a woman accustomed to managing difficult situations with grace. Abigail's wedding dress was elegant but understated, ivory silk with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs. Its high neckline and long sleeves were both fashionable and practical for a woman accustomed to dressing with dignity rather than display. A small cameo pendant, her grandmother's, rested at her throat. "There," Margaret said, stepping back to survey her handiwork. "You look beautiful, Abby." Abigail glanced at her reflection in the mirror, taking in the careful arrangement of her chestnut hair, the modest gown, and the slight unevenness of her posture, a permanent reminder of how fate marked some people without consultation. "I look appropriate," she corrected gently, "and that will have to suffice." Margaret's expression softened. "You've always been more than your reflection, my dear. Intelligence, character. These are what matter in a lifetime. Together." "We both know this isn't about a lifetime together, Mother," Abigail said, her voice steady. "This is about water rights, survival, and pragmatism. Mr. Montgomery needs our wells. We need his protection and market access. The arrangement is sensible." "He seemed decent," Margaret offered, "more thoughtful than his father." A ghost of a smile touched Abigail's lips. Faint praise, considering Emmett Montgomery's reputation. "Abigail," Margaret said, her tone sharpening slightly, "remember what's at stake. The Montgomerys can restore what we've lost. Security, position—" "I know exactly what's at stake," Abigail interrupted, rising from the vanity chair. "I've calculated it down to the last penny and the last drop of water. I agreed to this marriage with my eyes open, Mother. You needn't worry that I'll jeopardize it with unrealistic expectations." Margaret studied her daughter, concern and pride mingling in her expression. "No one would blame you for hoping for more than a business arrangement. Jackson Montgomery is not unattractive, and you're still young." "Mother," Abigail said firmly, "please don't. I've made my peace with what I am and what I can expect from life. I don't need pretty illusions." A soft knock at the door prevented further discussion. The maid entered, announcing that Emmett Montgomery had requested a brief meeting with Abigail before the ceremony. Abigail nodded, smoothing her skirts with practiced hands. "Send word that I'll join him in the library in 5 minutes." When the maid departed, Margaret stepped forward, adjusting Abigail's pendant with anxious fingers. "Remember, he's a hard man, but not an unreasonable one. Be respectful, but not subservient." "I know how to handle men like Emmett Montgomery," Abigail said calmly. "I watched Father navigate his type for years." The Montgomery Library was a testament to wealth acquired rather than knowledge pursued. Leather-bound volumes, arranged by color rather than subject, their pristine spines suggesting they were purchased by the yard rather than read with care. Emmett Montgomery stood before the massive fireplace, a tumbler of whiskey in his hand, despite the early hour. He turned as Abigail entered, his gaze sweeping over her with the assessing eye of a man calculating value. If her limp surprised or disturbed him, he gave no indication. "Miss Callahan," he said with a slight nod, "thank you for indulging my request." "Mr. Montgomery," Abigail replied, remaining near the door. "You wished to speak with me?" "Indeed." He gestured to a chair, but Abigail remained standing. After a moment, he continued, "I believe in clear understanding before entering into contracts. Makes for fewer complications later." "A sensible approach," Abigail agreed. "What clarification do you require?" Emmett set down his glass with deliberate precision. "My son seems to have developed a certain regard for your capabilities. He speaks highly of your business acumen. That's gratifying to hear." "It is unexpected," Emmett corrected. "Jackson has always been somewhat idealistic, sees potential where I see practicality." Abigail's expression remained composed, though she felt a flicker of wariness. "And you find this problematic?" "I find it important to establish expectations," Emmett said. "This marriage serves a purpose, to combine our water rights, salvage our herds, and preserve the Montgomery legacy. Nothing more." "I assure you." "Mr. Montgomery," Abigail replied evenly, "I harbor no romantic delusions about this arrangement. It is, as you say, a business matter." Something like approval flickered in Emmett's cold eyes. "Good. Then we understand each other." "Not entirely," Abigail said, her voice calm but firm. "While I recognize the nature of this union, I expect to be treated with the respect my position as your son's wife and business partner warrants. I will manage the combined records, oversee the integration of our operations, and speak when I have something worthwhile to contribute." Emmett's eyebrows rose slightly. "You're rather direct for a young woman." "I find it saves time," Abigail replied. "And in business, time is capital." For a moment, tension hung in the air between them, the old power assessing the new, the patriarch measuring this unexpected addition to his carefully controlled world. Then, surprisingly, Emmett Montgomery laughed, a short, sharp sound devoid of real humor, but containing a measure of genuine respect. "Thomas Callahan raised no fool," he said, almost to himself. "Very well, Miss Callahan, respect is earned, and you've made a promising start." "Abigail." Jackson's voice came from the doorway, where he stood in his wedding attire, his expression tightly controlled. The tension in his jaw suggested he had heard at least part of the exchange. His eyes moved from his father to his bride-to-be, a question in their depths. "Is everything all right?" "Perfectly." Abigail assured him with remarkable composure. "Your father and I were establishing a mutual understanding." "Indeed!" Emmett picked up his whiskey again. "I find your future wife refreshingly pragmatic, Jackson. Perhaps there's more to this arrangement than I initially calculated." Jackson's gaze remained on Abigail. "I believe we established that when we met." A clock somewhere in the house chimed the hour. Emmett straightened, business once again at the forefront. "Time for positions. Judge Hollister doesn't appreciate tardiness, even from me." As Emmett departed, Jackson remained in the doorway, his eyes still on Abigail. "Did he upset you?" The question surprised her, not just its content, but the genuine concern behind it. "No," she answered honestly. "Your father is exactly what I expected, clear in his priorities, direct in his methods." "He can be ruthless," Jackson said, choosing his words carefully, "particularly when it comes to the family legacy." "Most successful men are ruthless, Mr. Montgomery," Abigail replied. "My father included. The difference lies in where they draw their lines." Jackson studied her face, not avoiding her eyes or focusing on her posture, as many did, but seeming to look for something deeper, something behind her careful composure. "And where do you draw yours?" he asked quietly. Abigail hadn't expected the question, nor the sincere interest it conveyed. For a brief moment, her practiced poise wavered. "I believe in fair exchanges," she said finally. "I don't expect what I haven't earned, and I don't give what isn't deserved." "A straightforward philosophy," Jackson observed. "I'm a straightforward woman, Mr. Montgomery." Something like a smile touched his lips. "Jackson," he corrected gently, "if we're to be married in less than an hour, perhaps we should use our given names." Abigail nodded, the smallest acknowledgement. "Jackson, then." He offered his arm with unexpected formality. "Shall we proceed to our positions, Abigail? It seems we have a wedding to attend." The garden of the Montgomery estate had been transformed for the occasion, not with excessive decoration, but with the kind of tasteful elegance that spoke of wealth confident enough to appear understated. Chairs arranged in neat rows faced a small pavilion where Judge Hollister waited, his judicial robes exchanged for formal attire befitting his role as officiant. The guests were few, key investors in the Montgomery operation, the town banker and his wife, the mayor, Lucas Hayes, representing the ranch hands, and a handful of local merchants whose prosperity depended on the cattle that flowed from Whispering Pines. Notably absent were the usual wedding guests, no childhood friends, no extended family, no one who attended for any reason except business interest or social obligation. Margaret Callahan sat in the front row, her posture rigid with dignity despite her reduced circumstances. Beside her, conspicuously empty, was the seat that would have been Thomas Callahan's, the father who would not walk his daughter down the aisle. Emmett Montgomery stood to one side of the pavilion, overseeing the proceedings with the air of a man conducting a merger rather than witnessing a marriage. His satisfaction was evident, not joy for his son, but the completion of a necessary transaction. At precisely 2 o'clock, Jackson took his position before the judge. A moment later, music from a hired string quartet signaled Abigail's approach. She walked alone down the makeshift aisle, her steps measured and purposeful, her eyes fixed forward. The guests' reactions varied but were telling. Some managed polite neutrality, others couldn't hide their momentary notice of her uneven gait. Still others exchanged glances that spoke volumes about their assessment of Jackson Montgomery's fate. Jackson, however, watched her approach with an expression that revealed nothing except perhaps a quiet admiration for her composure. When she reached him, he extended his hand, not by rote, but with a deliberate gentleness that seemed to say, "I see you. Abigail placed her hand in his, and together they faced Judge Hollister. The ceremony was brief and businesslike. No flowery declarations of eternal devotion, no romantic verses, just the legal language necessary to bind two people and their fortunes together. When asked if they took each other in matrimony, both Jackson and Abigail spoke their affirmations clearly, without hesitation, but also without particular emotion. "The rings, please," Judge Hollister intoned. Lucas Hayes stepped forward, producing a small velvet box that he handed to Jackson. From it, Jackson withdrew a wedding band, simple but elegant, a band of polished gold set with a small diamond. As he slipped it onto Abigail's finger, he said quietly, "With this ring, I pledge my honor in partnership." Not love, not devotion, but something they could both honestly promise. Abigail, in turn, placed a plain gold band on Jackson's finger, a ring that had belonged to her father, resized for her new husband. "With this ring, I pledge my loyalty and respect." Judge Hollister pronounced them husband and wife with the same tone he might use to declare a property deed valid. Jackson hesitated only briefly before leaning forward to place a chaste kiss on Abigail's cheek, deliberately choosing the moment to take her hand in a firm, respectful grip rather than the perfunctory gesture expected. The gesture, small but significant, did not go unnoticed by the assembled guests, nor did it escape Abigail, whose eyes widened slightly in surprise before her composure returned. The reception that followed was modest by Montgomery standards. A luncheon served on the terrace, champagne flowing freely enough to suggest prosperity without ostentation. The guests circulated, offering congratulations that sounded more like business endorsements than genuine well wishes. "Shrewd move," the banker murmured to Emmett. "The Callahan water rights were undervalued. Market looks favorable for the next quarter," another investor added, "if you can drive enough healthy stock to the railhead quickly enough." Through it all, Jackson and Abigail moved as a unit, accepting congratulations with polite gratitude, answering questions about their plans with careful coordination. To casual observers, they might have appeared like any other newly married couple, perhaps not passionately in love, but certainly compatible and aligned in purpose. Only Margaret Callahan, watching from a quiet corner of the terrace, noted the careful distance they maintained, the precise space between them, never too close, never too far, a choreography of respect rather than intimacy. As the afternoon waned and the guests began to depart, Jackson found himself standing beside his new wife at the garden's edge, momentarily isolated from the others. "You've handled this admirably," he said quietly. "Not everyone could maintain such dignity under such scrutiny." Abigail's gaze remained on the distant hills. "I've had a lifetime of scrutiny, Jackson. You develop certain skills." "I imagine so." He hesitated, then added, "I want you to know that I intend to honor our agreement in every respect. You will have my support, my protection, and my respect." Now she did turn to look at him, her expression questioning. "Is that unusual? To honor one's agreements?" "Unfortunately, yes," Jackson replied, "especially in marriages of convenience. But I believe that what begins as necessity can grow into something worthwhile, given time and mutual effort." Abigail studied him, searching for insincerity or condescension and finding neither. "That's a surprisingly optimistic view." "I'm told it's my greatest flaw," Jackson said with the hint of a smile, "seeing potential where others see only what is." Before Abigail could respond, Emmett approached, his expression indicating business rather than celebration. "The water rights transfer documents have arrived. We should review them before making decisions about immediate implementation." Just like that, the wedding day transformed back into a business day. Jackson nodded, his expression shifting from husband to heir apparent. Of course, Abigail should join us. Her knowledge of the water systems will be invaluable. Emmett's gaze flicked to Abigail, assessing once more. Very well. The study. 15 minutes. As he walked away, Abigail turned to Jackson with a raised eyebrow. Already putting me to work, husband? I assumed you'd prefer it to sitting with the remaining guests, discussing table linens and flower arrangements, Jackson replied. A genuine smile, small but real, touched Abigail's lips. A correct assumption. The rest of the wedding day passed in a blur of ledgers, water rights documents, and operational planning. By nightfall, the new Mr. and Mrs. Montgomery had established the framework for merging their water and grazing operations, allocated resources for immediate construction of irrigation channels to the northern pastures, and determined staffing needs for the expanded enterprise. It was, by any business standard, a productive day. By any romantic standard, it was perhaps the least sentimental wedding day in Wyoming Territory history. As evening fell, the awkwardness that had been held at bay by business matters finally descended. The Montgomery mansion had been prepared. For the newlyweds, Abigail's belongings moved to the East Wing suite, connected to Jackson's rooms by a discreet sitting area. The arrangement offered both proximity and privacy, a compromise between marital expectations and practical reality. Abigail stood in her new rooms, taking inventory of the space that would now be hers. The furnishings were expensive but impersonal. No one had bothered to inquire about her preferences or tastes. Like everything else in this arrangement, the accommodations were adequate, appropriate, and devoid of sentiment. A soft knock at the connecting door interrupted her thoughts. Jackson entered at her acknowledgement, still dressed in his wedding clothes, though he had removed his jacket and loosened his collar. I wanted to ensure you have everything you need, he said, remaining near the doorway, as if uncertain of his welcome. Mrs. Winslow has been most accommodating. Silence stretched between them, not comfortable but not entirely uncomfortable either, just the awkward reality of two strangers bound by law but not by choice. Tomorrow, Jackson said finally, I thought you might like to tour the ranch operations, see firsthand what we're working with before we implement the integration plan. Abigail nodded, grateful for the return to practical matters. That would be helpful. I've reviewed the property maps, but seeing the actual operation will provide better context. Another silence, longer this time. Abigail, Jackson began, then paused, as if searching for the right words. I want you to know that I understand the unusual nature of our situation. I don't expect... He trailed off, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. You don't expect a true marriage, Abigail finished for him, her voice steady. I understand, Jackson. I didn't enter this arrangement with romantic illusions. Relief flickered across his features, followed by something more complex. I was going to say that I don't expect an immediate adjustment. This is a significant change for both of us, and I believe we should allow ourselves time to acclimate. A sensible approach, Abigail agreed. Jackson nodded, studying her face in the lamplight. We've made a promising start today. The operational integration plan is sound. With proper execution, the combined enterprise should thrive. Yes, Abigail said, the business aspects are clear enough. And the personal aspects will develop as they may, Jackson added, his tone careful. With time and mutual respect, Abigail met his gaze directly. I believe we've established a foundation, of respect at least. Jackson inclined his head slightly, accepting her assessment. Then I bid you good night, Abigail. Sleep well. Good night, Jackson. After he had gone, Abigail moved to the window, gazing out at the moonlit landscape beyond. The silver light cast long shadows across the grounds of what was now her home, a place she had entered not by choice, but by necessity, bound to a man she barely knew, by vows that promised partnership without passion. Yet as she touched the wedding band on her finger, Abigail felt something unexpected. Not happiness exactly, but perhaps possibility. Jackson Montgomery was not what she had feared. He looked at her limp without flinching or pitying. He valued her mind and respected her capabilities. He had treated her with a genuine courtesy before witnesses, a public declaration that he accepted what others often dismissed. It was not love. It was not even the beginning of love. But it was perhaps the foundation for something neither of them had dared to hope for, a marriage of equals built on something more substantial than fleeting attraction or financial necessity. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, the reality of their business partnership, the scrutiny of the community, the continuing calculation of Emmett Montgomery. But tonight, in the quiet of her new rooms, Abigail allowed herself a moment of cautious optimism. Perhaps, just perhaps, fate had been kinder than she had dared to believe. The morning after the wedding dawned bright and harsh, sunlight streaming through the windows of Abigail's new bedroom with uncompromising clarity. She'd been awake for hours already, reviewing property maps and water yield reports by lamplight, preparing for the ranch tour Jackson had proposed. When a knock came at her door, she was already dressed in a practical navy skirt and crisp white blouse, her hair pinned neatly away from her face. "Enter," she called, closing the ledger on her desk. It was Mrs. Winslow, the Montgomery housekeeper, carrying a breakfast tray. The older woman hesitated briefly upon seeing Abigail already, dressed and working, then smiled with quiet approval. "Good morning, Mrs. Montgomery. I've brought your breakfast." The name Mrs. Montgomery sounded foreign to Abigail's ears. She had been Miss Callahan for 24 years, daughter of Thomas Callahan, keeper of her family's agricultural legacy. Now overnight she had become Mrs. Montgomery, mistress of this imposing house, wife to a man she barely knew. "Thank you, Mrs. Winslow," Abigail said, gesturing to a small table near the window. "And please call me Abigail." Mrs. Winslow set down the tray with practiced efficiency. "Mr. Jackson asked me to inform you that he'll meet you in the stables at 9, if that suits. The north pastures are a fair ride from the house." "That will be fine," Abigail replied, noting with interest the way Mrs. Winslow referred to her employer as Mr. Jackson, a small but telling indication of her long service and familiar position in the household. Mrs. Winslow lingered, arranging things on the tray with unnecessary precision. "If I might say, Miss Abigail, it's good to have a lady in the house again. It's been 15 years since the senior Mrs. Montgomery passed." Abigail acknowledged this with a slight nod. "I understand you've been with the Montgomerys for many years. Since Mr. Jackson was a boy," Mrs. Winslow confirmed. "Raised him after his mother died, more or less." She hesitated, then added with quiet emphasis, "He's a good man, different from his father." The statement hung in the air, not quite an assurance, not quite a plea, but something in between. Abigail studied the older woman, recognizing an ally offering subtle guidance. "I'm beginning to see that," Abigail replied carefully. Satisfied, Mrs. Winslow moved toward the door. "The brown riding habit in your wardrobe might be suitable for today's outing. Mr. Emmett had it made for dusty days on the range. I took the liberty of altering it for your height." After the housekeeper departed, Abigail ate sparingly, her mind already focusing on the day ahead. The mention of the previous Mrs. Montgomery sparked curiosity. What kind of woman had been Emmett Montgomery's wife? What kind of mother had raised Jackson to be the seemingly decent man who had emerged from beneath his father's stern influence? At precisely 9 o'clock, Abigail arrived at the stables to find Jackson checking the cinches on 2 saddled horses, his own black stallion and a gentle-looking bay mare with intelligent eyes. "Good morning," he said, turning at the sound of her approach. "I see Mrs. Winslow found you appropriate riding clothes." Abigail nodded, adjusting the fitted jacket of the brown habit. "Yes, though I brought my own as well." She paused, unsure how to phrase her next thought. "My mother was about your height," Jackson supplied, understanding her unspoken question, though perhaps not quite as... He gestured vaguely, then caught himself. "Practical," Abigail supplied with the ghost of a smile. "Your mother preferred more formal riding attire, I imagine." "Even for ranch inspections," Jackson confirmed, with a hint of warmth in his voice. "Though I can't recall her accompanying my father often." Jackson's eyebrows rose slightly in surprise when Abigail approached the bay mare and with practiced ease mounted astride rather than side saddle. Seeing his expression, she paused. "I prefer to ride astride, especially on ranch terrain," she said matter-of-factly. "It's safer and more sensible, particularly for someone with my limitations." She nodded toward her right leg. "If that's a problem." "Not at all," Jackson said quickly. "I'm simply not accustomed to ladies who prioritize practicality over convention." A moment later, they were riding away from the ranch house, Abigail sitting her horse with unexpected confidence, her skirts arranged modestly but functionally for the journey. Jackson shot her an appraising glance as they settled into a comfortable pace side by side. "You ride well," he observed. "Most women I've met prefer carriages." "My father believed in practical skills," Abigail replied. He said, "Wheat doesn't care if you're wearing petticoats or trousers, it only responds to proper tending." A smile tugged at the corner of Jackson's mouth. Sound philosophy. The Callahan farm was well managed under his guidance. Innovative, even in some of its approaches. He was ahead of his time, Abigail agreed, something softening in her expression. He implemented crop rotation when most farmers were still depleting their soil year after year, said that land was harder to replace than a season's profit. "A perspective my father doesn't share," Jackson said dryly, "though I've tried to institute similar practices where I can." They rode in companionable silence for a while, the landscape opening around them, rolling prairie giving way to more rugged terrain as they approached the northern grazing lands. In the distance, the silhouette of cattle herds dotted the horizon, dark shapes against the golden grassland. Abigail observed it all with keen interest, mentally comparing the scope of the Montgomery operation to what she remembered of her father's more modest enterprise. The differences were stark. Where the Callahan farm had employed perhaps 20 men at its peak, the Montgomery ranch clearly supported hundreds. The cattle herds alone represented more wealth than most territorial banks, held in their vaults. "Impressive," she acknowledged, as they crested a rise overlooking a vast pasture where hundreds of cattle grazed. 15 years of aggressive expansion," Jackson explained. "My father doesn't believe in moderation when it comes to acquiring land or increasing the herd." Something in his tone caught Abigail's attention. "You don't entirely approve." It wasn't a question, and Jackson didn't treat it as one. "I believe in sustainable growth," he said after a moment. "Expansion that allows for future prosperity, rather than exhausting every resource as quickly as possible." "A long-term perspective," Abigail noted, "uncommon in the West." "Perhaps that's why we're facing difficulties now," Jackson said, guiding his horse down the slope toward a dried-up creek bed. "The best grazing lands have been overstocked, and we haven't developed enough water sources to maintain the herds through dry seasons." At the edge of the northern pasture, they were greeted by Lucas Hayes, who had ridden ahead to prepare for their inspection. The foreman's weathered face creased in a smile as he tipped his hat to Abigail. "Welcome to the far reaches of Montgomery." "A territory, Mrs. Montgomery," he said, his informal manner suggesting he and Jackson shared a friendship that transcended employer and employee. "Though I expect you're no stranger to agricultural challenges." "Thank you, Mr. Hayes," Abigail replied. "And no, this isn't unfamiliar territory, though your operation is considerably larger than our farm." "Call me Lucas, please," he said, then turned to Jackson. The men are ready for the inspection. Williams is waiting to show you the proposed irrigation channel route from the eastern springs. The next hours were a revelation, not for the ranching operations themselves, which Abigail understood fundamentally from her years at her father's side, but for the way Jackson Montgomery conducted himself as a ranch owner. Where Emmett ruled through intimidation and distance, Jackson led through respect and engagement. He knew the workers by name, inquired after families, listened to concerns with genuine attention. More surprising still was the way Jackson included Abigail in every discussion, deferring to her expertise on water management questions, introducing her not as his wife, but as his partner in the enterprise. The cowboy's initial skepticism, both at her gender and her physical limitation, gave way to cautious respect as she demonstrated knowledge and asked incisive questions. By midday, they had toured the primary grazing lands, inspected the dried creek beds, and reviewed the plans for water diversion from the Callahan Springs. As they paused for a simple lunch of beef jerky, bread, and coffee in the shade of a cottonwood grove, Abigail found herself unexpectedly energized by the morning's activities. "Your operation is impressive," she said, accepting the tin cup of coffee Lucas offered, "though I see several areas where integration with the Callahan water systems could improve efficiency." Such as?" Jackson asked, leaning against his saddle, his posture relaxed but attentive. Abigail set down her cup and moved to where a rough map had been spread on a flat rock. "Your northern herds are losing condition because they're traveling too far between grazing and water. If we divert the eastern spring through this natural depression," she said, tracing the route with her finger, "we could create a series of watering stations along the way. The cattle would maintain better weight with less energy expended on travel." Jackson joined her at the map, studying the area she indicated. "If that's viable, we could increase carrying capacity by at least 15%. "Precisely," Abigail agreed. "And since the water flow is consistent year-round, you wouldn't need to reduce the herd during drought conditions." Lucas let out a low whistle. Long-term planning over quick profit. Emmett won't like that approach. Abigail glanced at Jackson, noting the slight tightening of his jaw at the mention of his father's preferences. "It's sound ranching strategy," she said firmly, "and ultimately more profitable." "I agree," Jackson said, his eyes still on the map. "We'll begin surveying immediately to confirm the gradient. Lucas, can you reassign Wilson's team to this?" As they continued discussing operational details, Abigail became aware of a subtle shift in the dynamic between them. What had begun as a marriage of financial necessity was evolving unexpectedly into a genuine partnership of compatible minds. Jackson listened to her suggestions without condescension, built upon her ideas with his own insights, and together, they crafted plans that neither might have developed independently. It was not intimacy, not yet, but it was a kind of connection she hadn't anticipated. The satisfaction of being truly heard and valued for her mind rather than judged for her appearance or dismissed for her gender. Their return to the Montgomery ranch late that afternoon coincided with the arrival of a carriage bearing the county's most prominent socialite, Victoria Preston, and her daughter, Elizabeth. As Jackson and Abigail dismounted in the courtyard, still dusty from their day on the range, Mrs. Preston emerged from her carriage with the determined air of a general advancing into battle. "Jackson Montgomery," she called, waving her hand imperiously. "We've come to pay our respects to your new bride, though I must say we expected to find her at home, not—" Her gaze swept over Abigail's practical riding habit and dust-streaked. Appearance, disapproval evident in every line of her face. "Mrs. Preston," Jackson replied with stiff courtesy. "How kind of you to call. Allow me to present my wife, Abigail Montgomery." Abigail stepped forward, acutely aware of her disheveled state but refusing to be diminished by it. "Mrs. Preston, Miss Preston," Please excuse our appearance. We've just returned from touring the ranch operations. Victoria Preston's eyebrows rose toward her elaborate coiffure. The ranch? On your first day of marriage? How unusual. Behind her mother, Elizabeth Preston, a pretty blonde woman of perhaps 20, watched the exchange with poorly concealed curiosity, her eyes lingering on Abigail's uneven stance with the fascination of someone viewing an exotic creature. My wife has considerable expertise in agricultural management, Jackson said, his voice taking on a protective edge that surprised Abigail. Her insights are invaluable to our enterprise. Indeed, Mrs. Preston's tone suggested she found this claim dubious at best. Well, perhaps next time you might consider your wife's position in society, Jackson. A lady's reputation is built on propriety, not commercial activities. Abigail felt Jackson tense beside her and placed a restraining hand on his arm. I appreciate your concern for my reputation, Mrs. Preston, she said smoothly. But I find fulfillment in contributing to the family business. Now, won't you come inside? Mrs. Winslow will have refreshments ready, and I'd be delighted to hear the latest news from town. The next hour in the Montgomery parlor was an exercise in social warfare disguised as polite conversation. Victoria Preston, clearly disappointed to find Abigail articulate and composed, despite her physical limitation, launched a series of subtle attacks disguised as helpful advice. Of course, you'll want to redecorate, she said, glancing around the parlor with critical eyes. The late Mrs. Montgomery had exquisite taste, but everything appears rather dated now. I'd be happy to introduce you to my dressmaker as well. She's quite skilled at designing gowns that create flattering silhouettes. The implication was clear. Abigail needed all the help she could get to appear presentable in her new role. Before Abigail could respond, Elizabeth Preston leaned forward with manufactured sympathy. It must be so difficult, she said in a stage whisper, having to adjust to being seen after living so privately for so long. Abigail maintained her composure, years of enduring similar comments, having forged an armor of dignity around her. Actually, Miss Preston, I find transparency quite refreshing in business and in social matters. Jackson, who had remained largely silent during the exchange, suddenly stood. If you'll excuse us, Mrs. Preston, my wife and I have matters to discuss before dinner. The new irrigation plan requires immediate attention. The dismissal was polite, but firm. After the Prestons had departed with promises to include Abigail in the next ladies' auxiliary meeting, Jackson turned to her with an expression of mingled admiration and concern. I apologize for that ambush, he said. Victoria Preston is a dedicated collector of gossip and dispenser of judgment. Abigail shook her head slightly. No need for apologies. Women like Mrs. Preston exist in every social circle. They patrol the boundaries of acceptability and extract payment in the form of deference from those they deem less fortunate. Jackson studied her for a moment. You handled her beautifully. Most new arrivals to Silver Creek society crumble under her scrutiny. Years of practice, Abigail said simply, then with a hint of humor. Besides, I suspect she was more disappointed to find you married than to find me marked. Jackson looked startled, then thoughtful. Elizabeth has been paraded before every eligible bachelor in the territory. I hadn't considered that might include me. A cattle baron's son, unquestionably. Abigail removed her riding gloves, her practical nature reasserting itself. Now, about that irrigation plan, I've been considering an alternative approach that might reduce the initial investment while increasing long-term yield. The abrupt shift from social warfare to business strategy seemed to amuse Jackson. You truly are remarkable, he said, the words escaping him almost involuntarily. Abigail glanced up, surprised by the genuine admiration in his voice. For a moment, they regarded each other with new awareness, not as reluctant partners in an arranged marriage, but as allies who had unexpectedly discovered mutual respect. The moment passed as Mrs. Winslow entered to announce dinner, but something had shifted between them. A foundation laid not on romantic notions or physical attraction, but on the more enduring ground of intellectual compatibility and shared purpose. That evening, in the privacy of her rooms, Abigail sat at her dressing table, removing the pins from her hair. The face that looked back at her from the mirror was the same one she had seen every day of her life, the same green eyes, the same determined mouth, the same woman who had learned to define herself by her capabilities rather than her limitations. Yet something felt different, as if the woman behind the reflection had changed in some fundamental way. For the first time in years, she had spent an entire day being valued for her mind, rather than judged for her physical limitations. Jackson Montgomery, contrary to all expectations, had treated her as a partner rather than an acquisition. He had defended her capabilities to others, included her in meaningful work, and listened to her ideas with genuine interest. It was not love. Abigail was far too practical to indulge in such fanciful notions, but it was respect, perhaps even the beginning of friendship. And for a woman who had long ago resigned herself to a life defined by limitations rather than possibilities, that unexpected development was both bewildering and quietly thrilling. As she prepared for bed, Abigail's thoughts turned to the days ahead. Tomorrow they would begin integration of the Callahan water systems with the Montgomery grazing operations. The work would be challenging, the resistance from some quarters inevitable. Emmett Montgomery would undoubtedly scrutinize her every decision, looking for weaknesses to exploit or mistakes to criticize. Yet for the first time since her father's death, Abigail felt a sense of purpose beyond mere survival. The Montgomery Callahan enterprise offered a chance to implement innovations her father had only dreamed of, to create something lasting and valuable. And in Jackson, she had found an unexpected ally, someone who saw beyond her limp to the woman. Beneath, as she extinguished the lamp beside her bed, Abigail allowed herself a small, private smile. Perhaps this arrangement, born of necessity rather than choice, might yield unexpected rewards after all, like the hidden springs that ran beneath the prairie, waiting to be discovered by those patient enough to look beyond the surface. 3 weeks into their marriage, a rhythm had established itself at the Montgomery ranch. Each morning, Abigail and Jackson would breakfast together in the small sunroom, reviewing the previous day's reports and planning their priorities. By 8 o'clock, they would ride out together, spending their days overseeing the integration of the Callahan water systems and the Montgomery grazing operations. The work was challenging but rewarding. As Abigail had predicted, the irrigation channels from the eastern springs were transforming the parched northern pastures. Under her guidance, the water management systems were restructured, bringing greater efficiency to the operation's resources. Meanwhile, Jackson focused on implementing improved breeding programs throughout the expanded herd. To the surprise of many and the consternation of some, they worked well together. Abigail's meticulous attention to detail complemented Jackson's broader vision. Her knowledge of water management enhanced his understanding of cattle breeding. Together, they formed a partnership that was beginning to earn grudging respect even from Emmett Montgomery, who had taken to observing their progress with calculating eyes. On this particular morning, however, that rhythm was disrupted. As Abigail entered the sunroom for breakfast, she found not Jackson, but Emmett waiting for her, a cup of coffee in one hand and the territorial newspaper in the other. "Abigail," he acknowledged with a brief nod. "Sit. We need to discuss some matters." Abigail took her usual chair, maintaining her composure despite the unexpected confrontation. "Good morning, Mr. Montgomery. Is Jackson joining us?" "He's at the South Range. There was an issue with the new breeding stock." Emmett folded his newspaper with precise movements. which leaves us an opportunity to speak frankly. Abigail poured herself coffee, using the moment to prepare for whatever challenge Emmett intended to present. I always prefer frankness to ambiguity. Emmett studied her with the same assessing gaze he might give a promising but unproven cattle bloodline. The integration of operations is proceeding more efficiently than I anticipated. Production reports are encouraging. The men seem to accept your involvement despite its unusual nature. Thank you, Abigail said, recognizing that from Emmett Montgomery, this constituted high praise. It wasn't a compliment, Emmett clarified. It was an observation, one that prompts a question. What exactly are your ambitions here, Abigail? The directness of the inquiry didn't surprise her. Emmett had never been one for subtlety. My ambitions are straightforward, she replied. To ensure the continued success of the Montgomery Callahan enterprise, to honor my father's legacy through sound business practices, to fulfill my role as Jackson's wife in all aspects that matter. Emmett's eyes narrowed slightly. And beyond that, there are whispers in town that you've begun attending the Cattlemen's Association meetings, that you've spoken about modernizing grazing methods, implementing new breeding protocols. These are not traditional concerns for a rancher's wife. Abigail met his gaze steadily. The world is changing, Mr. Montgomery. Ranching must change with it. Better breeding programs mean healthier cattle, which mean consistent profits and lower losses from disease and poor conditions. You sound like Jackson, Emmett said, disapproval evident in his tone. Perhaps because we share similar perspectives on effective management, Abigail replied. Emmett leaned forward, his coffee forgotten. Let me be clear, Abigail. I accepted this marriage as a necessary business arrangement. I respect your knowledge of your father's water systems, but the Montgomery enterprise has succeeded for 30 years under my leadership with methods I have proven effective. Methods that left your northern herds dying of thirst and your profits declining for 3 consecutive seasons, Abigail pointed out quietly. The color rose in Emmett's face, but he controlled his reaction with the discipline of a man accustomed to hard negotiations. Watch yourself, Abigail. Remember your position here. I remember it clearly, she said, her voice level. As Jackson's wife and business partner, as co-owner of significant water rights that saved the Montgomery operation from potential ruin, as someone with expertise and insight valuable to our shared enterprise. For a long moment, they regarded each other across the table, the old power and the new, measuring boundaries and testing resolve. Then, surprisingly, Emmett smiled. Not warmly, but with a certain reluctant respect. Thomas Callahan raised a formidable daughter, he said. But remember this, formidable women have fallen before. Tread carefully. With that cryptic warning, he rose and departed, leaving Abigail alone with her cooling coffee and the unsettling awareness that she had just established herself as more than an accessory to the Montgomery empire. She had declared herself a player in her own right. Later that morning, Abigail rode to the North Range alone, her mind still processing the confrontation with Emmett. The implications of his warning troubled her. Not because she feared him, but because she recognized the potential for conflict between father and son if Emmett perceived her influence over Jackson as a threat. At the main corral, she found Lucas Hayes reviewing the day's assignments with several ranch hands. The men fell silent as she entered, their expressions varying from discomfort to curiosity to outright hostility. "Mrs. Montgomery," Lucas greeted her. "We weren't expecting you today." "Clearly," Abigail replied dryly. "Please continue your discussion. I'm here to review the water flow reports from yesterday's measurements." The men exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them that Abigail couldn't quite decipher. Finally, one of the older hands, Williams, she recalled, a 20-year veteran of the Montgomery operation, cleared his throat. "Ma'am, with all due respect, we're discussing technical matters, ranching issues. How fortunate, then, that I understand ranching," Abigail replied evenly. "Unless there's something specific you're concerned about sharing with me." Another uncomfortable silence fell. Lucas shot her an apologetic look before addressing the group. "Mrs. Montgomery grew up in the industry, gentlemen. Her father was Thomas Callahan, and she managed his books and operations for years. She knows what she's about." Williams frowned, skepticism etched in the lines of his weathered face. "It's not about knowing books, Hayes. It's about knowing cattle. The herd in the north sector is getting restless about these new watering schedules. Takes longer to move them between grazing areas. Cuts into our time for other tasks." Abigail moved to the corral fence, studying the cattle milling in the distance. The new watering protocol adds approximately 1 hour to the daily routine, but reduces travel strain by 40%. Last month's cattle drive to the railhead showed a 15% increase in arrival weight, which translates directly to higher prices. Which costs more, 1 hour of additional herding or 15% of your annual profit? Her practical assessment seemed to take Williams by surprise. He blinked, then nodded reluctantly. "Put that way, it makes sense. But the men don't always think that far ahead. They see today's extra work, not next month's profit share." "Then we adjust the compensation structure," Abigail said, inspiration striking. "Implement a weight bonus. Teams whose cattle show the highest market weight at sale time receive a percentage premium. It rewards patience rather than punishing it." Lucas's eyes lit with interest. That could work. The weight improvements would offset the bonus costs within a single season if we prevent even a modest decline in condition. Williams still looked skeptical, but less hostile. "The men might go for that, but Will Emmett Montgomery, he's not, one for spending extra on wages." "Leave my father to me," came Jackson's voice from the corral entrance. He entered, removing his gloves, dust streaking his face from the morning's work with the breeding stock. "Abigail's right. We can't afford another season of underweight cattle at market, and we can't afford to lose good men to operations with better compensation." His gaze met Abigail's across the corral yard, a look of approval and something warmer that sent an unexpected flutter through her chest. "I see you've been solving problems without me," he said with a small smile. "Just proposing solutions," Abigail corrected. "Implementation will require your authority." "Our authority," Jackson amended, turning to the assembled ranch hands. "My wife's insights are proving invaluable to this operation, gentlemen. I suggest we all benefit from her expertise rather than resisting it out of habit or prejudice." The directness of his statement hung in the air, challenging years of tradition and preconception. After a moment, Williams nodded, offering Abigail a grudging but genuine tip of his hat. "Fair enough, Mr. Montgomery. We'll draft the new bonus. Structure this afternoon, Mrs. Montgomery, if you'd care to review it." The meeting dispersed, leaving Abigail and Jackson alone in the corral yard. He moved to the fence, watching the men return to their various duties across the bustling ranch. "I overheard part of that exchange," he said. "You handled it well." "Experience," Abigail replied. "I faced similar resistance at my father's operation after his death. Men who respected him still couldn't bring themselves to take direction from his daughter." Jackson turned to face her, his expression thoughtful. "Yet here you are, winning over the most stubborn crew in the Wyoming territory, including, apparently, my father." Abigail raised an eyebrow. "What makes you think I've won over Emmett?" "He mentioned at breakfast that you had unexpected competence," Jackson said with a faint smile. "From him, that's practically a glowing endorsement." Abigail hesitated, then decided on honesty. Your father and I had a different sort of conversation at breakfast. He seemed concerned about my influence on operational decisions. A shadow crossed Jackson's face. Did he threaten you? Not explicitly, Abigail assured him. More of a warning to remember my place. Your place, Jackson repeated, a hint of anger in his voice, as if being born female and walking with a limp somehow diminishes your intelligence or capability. The vehemence of his defense surprised Abigail. Over the past weeks, Jackson had consistently shown her respect, but this was something more. Indignation on her behalf, a protective instinct that suggested he valued her beyond her usefulness to the business. Thank you, she said simply, but I've faced worse than your father's disapproval. What concerns me is creating conflict between you. Jackson's expression softened. My father and I have never seen eye to eye on management philosophy. Long before you arrived, we disagreed on everything from cattle breeding to employee relations. Your presence hasn't created conflict. It's merely highlighted what was already there. He moved closer, his voice lowering slightly. What you have done, Abigail, is provide me with an ally I never expected to find, someone who understands both the business and my vision for its future. The sincerity in his eyes made Abigail acutely aware of his proximity, of the subtle shift that had been occurring between them over these weeks of working side by side. What had begun as a marriage of convenience, a business arrangement endorsed by signatures rather than sentiment, had evolved into something neither had anticipated, a partnership based on mutual respect, shared goals, and growing affection. Before either could acknowledge this unspoken transformation, a commotion outside drew their attention. Shouts echoed across the ranch yard, urgent and alarmed. Jackson moved quickly to the corral gate, then swore under his breath. Rustlers, he said tersely. Northern herd. Rustlers, Jackson said tersely. Northern herd. They rushed outside to find chaos unfolding. Cowboys mounted in haste, rifles being distributed, orders shouted across the yard. Lucas Hayes was at the center, directing men with practiced efficiency. 20 heads stolen at least, he reported as Jackson and Abigail approached. Clarkson spotted them driving cattle toward Blackwater Canyon. 6 men, well armed. Without hesitation, Abigail joined the preparations, gathering men into organized groups while Jackson conferred with Lucas about pursuit strategy. If the rustlers reached the canyon with the stolen cattle, they could disappear into the maze of trails that led to the territorial border. Mrs. Montgomery, you shouldn't be involved, one of the younger cowboys protested as she helped check ammunition supplies. It's not safe for a lady. It's not safe for anyone, Abigail replied, passing cartridge boxes with practiced hands. Which is why every person matters. Now work, don't argue. For the next hour, the ranch yard hummed with disciplined activity. Jackson moved through the chaos with calm authority, directing efforts, adjusting strategy, ensuring every man knew his role. Abigail worked alongside Mrs. Winslow to prepare supplies, food, bandages, extra ammunition, anything the pursuit party might need. This, she realized, was the true measure of the man she had married. Not his family name or his business acumen, but his character revealed under pressure, his willingness to protect what was his while ensuring the safety of those who served him. As the pursuit party assembled, Jackson approached Abigail, his expression grave. Stay close to the house. These rustlers may be part of the Jenkins gang. They've been raiding ranches across the territory for months, and they're known to be violent. Abigail nodded, understanding the severity of the situation. Cattle rustling was more than theft. It was a direct challenge to a rancher's authority, a crime punishable by hanging in the unwritten law of the West. Be careful, she said simply, meeting his eyes. Something passed between them in that moment, concern that transcended their business arrangement, a connection neither had anticipated building so quickly. I will, Jackson promised, then mounted his stallion and led the pursuit party out. At a gallop, dust billowing behind them as they rode toward the northern pastures. Left behind at the ranch house, Abigail found herself facing the uncertain hours of waiting that were the lot of those who remained while others rode into danger. She channeled her anxiety into practical action, organizing the household to prepare for various contingencies, caring for wounded men, feeding the returning pursuit party, securing the homestead against any potential attack. As dusk approached, Emmett Montgomery returned from a business trip to Silver Creek, his expression darkening as Mrs. Winslow explained the situation. "Damn Jenkins and his cutthroats," he muttered, pouring himself a generous measure of whiskey. "Third raid on our stock this month." Abigail looked up sharply from the bandages she was preparing. "Third?" Jackson didn't mention previous raids. Emmett's mouth tightened. "My son doesn't share all the ranch's troubles with you. Some matters are beyond a woman's concern. Matters affecting our livelihood are precisely my concern," Abigail countered, setting aside the medical supplies. "If this is the third raid, there's a pattern. Have you notified the territorial marshal?" "The marshal has an entire territory to patrol with too few men," Emmett dismissed. "We handle our own problems in this country." Abigail studied the older man, thinking rapidly. "The repeated raids suggest local knowledge, someone who knows your herd movements, perhaps your ranch routines." Emmett raised an eyebrow, surprised by her reasoning. "What are you suggesting?" "That this may not be random," Abigail said. "The Jenkins gang has a reputation for careful planning. Someone could be feeding them information." Before Emmett could respond, the sound of approaching riders drew them to the porch. The pursuit party returned, their expressions grim but determined. Jackson dismounted, his clothing dust-covered, his face lined with fatigue, but otherwise unharmed. "We recovered the cattle," he reported as he approached the porch, "caught up to them before they reached the canyon. 2 of their men wounded, but all escaped into the high country." "Any of our men hurt?" Emmett demanded. "Williams took a bullet in the arm. Doc Sullivan's tending to him now." Jackson's eyes found Abigail's, a silent message of reassurance passing between them. Later that evening, after the ranch had settled into an uneasy calm, Abigail found Jackson in his study, poring over maps of the northern grazing lands, planning increased security measures. "You didn't tell me there had been previous raids," she said, closing the door behind her. Jackson looked up, fatigue evident in his face. "I didn't want to worry you with ranch security concerns so soon. I'm not some delicate flower needing protection from harsh realities," Abigail replied, moving to the desk. "These raids threaten everything we're building. I should be informed." Jackson studied her for a moment, then nodded. "You're right. I apologize." The simple acknowledgement surprised her. Most men she had known would have defended their decision, insisted on their right to withhold information they deemed unsuitable for a woman's ears. Jackson's willingness to recognize her legitimate concern spoke volumes about his character. "I have a theory," she said, spreading her own maps on the desk beside his. "These raids aren't random. Look at the pattern. All 3 targeted specific areas of the northern herd, all happened during the new moon, all occurred when most hands would be occupied elsewhere." Jackson's brow furrowed as he examined her notations. "You think someone's providing inside information?" "It's the most logical explanation," Abigail confirmed. "Someone who knows your operation well enough to predict vulnerabilities." Tenacity. They worked late into the night, analyzing patterns, identifying potential security weaknesses, developing a strategy to identify the source of the information leak. Through it all, Abigail was acutely aware of a deepening connection between them, a partnership that transcended their initial business arrangement to become something more meaningful. As midnight approached, Jackson finally set down his pen and leaned back in his chair. "We should get some rest. Tomorrow we'll be busy with implementing these new security measures." Abigail nodded, gathering her notes, but hesitated before leaving. Today could have ended very differently. The Jenkins gang is known for its brutality. Yes, Jackson acknowledged, but it didn't. The cattle are recovered, our men are safe, and we've developed a plan to prevent future raids. Partners. In adversity, Abigail said softly, almost to herself. Jackson's gaze held hers. Perhaps adversity reveals the true nature of partnership more clearly than prosperity ever could. The simple observation lingered in Abigail's mind as she prepared for bed that night. When she had agreed to this marriage, she had expected at best a cordial business relationship, at worst a lifetime of being tolerated for the water rights she brought to the union. She had never anticipated finding in Jackson Montgomery a true partner, someone who valued her mind, respected her capabilities, and was beginning to see beyond her physical limitations to the woman herself. It was not love, not yet, but it was the foundation for something deeper than she had dared to hope for in her carefully circumscribed life. The weeks following the rustling incident brought significant changes to the Montgomery ranch. Jackson and Abigail's security plan was implemented with methodical precision, changing cattle rotation schedules, establishing new patrol patterns, creating a coded communication system between ranch hands. More surprising to the local community was Abigail's increasing visibility in ranch operations. She regularly attended Cattlemen's Association meetings alongside Jackson, contributed to breeding and water management decisions, and established a new accounting system that tracked ranch productivity with unprecedented clarity. The reactions to her prominence varied. Some old guard ranchers muttered disapprovingly about a woman overstepping traditional boundaries, while younger, more progressive operators noted with interest the improvements at the Montgomery spread. Most telling was Emmett Montgomery's gradual shift from skepticism to grudging respect. Though he never openly acknowledged Abigail's contributions, he increasingly included her in business discussions and listened to her suggestions with growing attention. As fall approached, bringing cooler temperatures and early frosts to the high country, preparations began for the season's final cattle drive to the railhead at Casper. The drive represented the culmination of the year's work, the moment when months of breeding decisions, grazing management, and water conservation would translate into market prices that would sustain the ranch through the coming winter. 2 days before the drive was scheduled to begin, Jackson and Abigail rode to the northern pastures to inspect the herd one final time. The cattle looked healthy and well-conditioned, their coats glossy in the autumn sunlight. The new watering system has made a remarkable difference, Jackson observed as they surveyed the herd from a ridgeline. These cattle will bring top dollar at market. Abigail nodded, satisfaction evident in her expression. The weight gain is consistently 15% above last year's records. The irrigation channels from the eastern springs proved even more effective than I anticipated. As they rode among the cattle, checking condition and finalizing numbers for the drive, Jackson found himself watching Abigail with a new awareness. Over these months of working together, her physical limitations had receded in his consciousness. He no longer noticed her limp. Instead, he saw her determination, her intelligence, her unwavering commitment to their shared enterprise. "There's something I want to show you," he said as they finished their inspection. "A place not far from here." Curious, Abigail followed as he led them away from the herd, up a winding trail that climbed steadily toward a high ridge overlooking the entire northern range. The ascent was steep in places, but she managed her mount with practiced skill, never requesting assistance despite the challenging terrain. When they reached the summit, Jackson dismounted and helped Abigail from her horse, his hands lingering slightly longer than necessary at her waist. The touch, brief but deliberate, sent an unexpected warmth through her. "My mother brought me here as a boy," Jackson explained, leading her to the edge of the ridge. She said it was the one place where you could truly understand what the Montgomerys had built. The view was breathtaking. From this elevation, the entire northern section of the ranch spread before them. Vast grasslands dotted with cattle, winding creeks now flowing with water diverted from the Callahan Springs, the complex network of operations that supported one of the territory's most successful cattle enterprises. "It's magnificent," Abigail said softly, the pride in her voice unmistakable. Not just appreciation for the Montgomery legacy, but pride in her own contributions to its continuing prosperity. Jackson turned to face her, his expression uncharacteristically uncertain. "My father arranged our marriage as a business solution to a water crisis," he said carefully. "But I find myself increasingly grateful for the arrangement, regardless of its origins." Abigail met his gaze, her own carefully maintained composure momentarily wavering. "As do I," she acknowledged quietly. "These months working together, seeing your mind, your determination, your vision for what this land could be, have been unexpected in the best possible way." Jackson continued, moving closer. "I no longer think of our marriage as merely a business arrangement, Abigail." Her heart quickened at his words and the earnest expression in his eyes. "What do you see it as, then?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. "A partnership that could become something more," he said simply. "If you're willing." Before Abigail could respond, a rider appeared on the trail below, approaching. At speed, Lucas Hayes, his expression urgent even from a distance. The moment broken, they turned their attention to the approaching foreman. Whatever Jackson had been about to say would have to wait. "Trouble," Lucas reported as he reached them. "Victor Preston is at the ranch house, demanding to speak with you. Says he has proof that you've been diverting water illegally from Silver Creek to feed your irrigation channels." Jackson's expression hardened. "Preston's been trying to undermine our water rights for years. This is just his latest tactic." "There's more," Lucas continued grimly. "He's brought the territorial water commissioner with him. They're threatening an immediate injunction that could shut down our entire northern operation." The implications were severe. Without water access, the cattle wouldn't survive the journey to market. The entire season's profits could be lost. "We need to return immediately," Jackson said, already moving toward his horse. "Preston won't hesitate to use legal maneuvering to damage our position." As they rode hard back to the ranch house, Abigail's mind raced through possibilities. Victor Preston was Silver Creek's banker and Elizabeth's father, a man known for using financial leverage to acquire properties he coveted. The timing of this accusation, just before the cattle drive, suggested deliberate sabotage rather than genuine legal concern. When they arrived at the ranch yard, they found a tense standoff. Victor Preston, a corpulent man with cold eyes and an air of smug certainty, stood on the porch alongside a nervous-looking official whom Abigail assumed was the water commissioner. Emmett Montgomery faced them, his posture rigid with barely controlled fury. "Ah, here's the younger Montgomery now," Preston called as Jackson dismounted. "Perhaps you'd care to explain how your irrigation channels are stealing water from Silver Creek tributaries that rightfully belong to other landowners." "Our water usage is entirely legal," Jackson replied evenly, helping Abigail from her horse. "Every channel runs from springs on our combined property." Preston's gaze shifted to Abigail, his expression calculating. "Ah, yes, the convenient marriage that suddenly gave you access to the Callahan water rights. How fortunate for you." The water commissioner, a thin man with an apologetic demeanor, stepped forward with several documents. "Mr. Montgomery, these surveys suggest that at least 2 of your new channels draw from watershed that feeds Silver Creek. According to territorial law, that makes them subject to riparian water rights regulations." "Those surveys are incorrect," Abigail said firmly, stepping forward. The eastern channels draw exclusively from underground springs, not surface watershed. Preston's eyebrows rose in mock surprise. How interesting that Mrs. Montgomery believes herself qualified to dispute official territorial surveys. Perhaps her condition affects more than her mobility. The deliberate insult hung in the air like gun smoke. Jackson took a step forward, fury evident in his face, but Abigail's hand on his arm stopped him. "My condition, Mr. Preston," she said evenly, "includes a thorough education in hydrological mapping. My father ensured I understood water systems completely before entrusting me with the management of our property." She turned to the commissioner. "If you'll accompany me to my office, I can show you the original surveys my father conducted, along with the geological reports that confirm the underground nature of our spring systems. They're completely separate from the Silver Creek watershed." The commissioner glanced uncertainly at Preston, then nodded. "I'd be interested to review those documents, Mrs. Montgomery." As they moved inside, Abigail caught Jackson's eye, a silent message passing between them. "Handle Preston. I'll address the legal concerns." The next hour passed in tense discussion. In the study, Abigail methodically presented evidence of the Callahan Springs' independent nature, explaining the geological formations that created underground water systems separate from surface watershed, with a clarity that gradually replaced the commissioner's doubt with understanding. Meanwhile, in the parlor, Jackson confronted Preston directly. "This isn't about water rights," he said bluntly when they were alone. "What's your real purpose here, Victor?" Preston's mask of civic concern fell away, revealing the calculating businessman beneath. "You've built quite an operation, Montgomery. The combination of your grazing lands and the Callahan water rights has created the most valuable ranch in the territory. I'm simply exploring whether it might be available." "The Montgomery ranch isn't for sale," Jackson stated flatly. "Everything has a price," Preston countered smoothly. "Your father's debts from last year's drought aren't completely resolved, despite your convenient marriage. The bank holds notes that could become due with the right pressure." Understanding dawned. "So that's your game. Create a legal crisis, threaten our cattle drive, force us into a financial corner, then swoop in with an offer just substantial enough to prevent complete ruin." Preston shrugged, unapologetic. "Business is business, Montgomery, nothing personal. Using false surveys and manipulating territorial officials seems rather personal," Jackson observed coldly. "Merely expedient," Preston replied. "I find that creating the right crisis often reveals surprising opportunities. Think about it. One signature on a sales agreement, and all these legal troubles disappear. You and your charming but damaged wife could start fresh elsewhere without the burden of maintaining this massive operation." Before Jackson could respond, Abigail entered with the commissioner, who appeared significantly chastened. "Mr. Preston," the commissioner said uncomfortably, "I've reviewed Mrs. Montgomery's documentation. The surveys you provided appear to have significant discrepancies when compared with the official geological reports." "What are you saying?" Preston demanded, his confident demeanor slipping. "I'm saying there are no grounds for an injunction," the commissioner stated firmly. "The Montgomery water usage is entirely legal according to territorial statutes. Their springs are not part of the Silver Creek watershed." Preston's face darkened with fury. "You can't possibly take the word of a crippled woman over official surveys." "Mr. Preston," the commissioner's voice sharpened, "Mrs. Montgomery's evidence includes government geological surveys from 1878, watershed mapping from the Territorial Land Office, and underground water table assessments conducted by the Department of Agriculture. Will confirm her assertions." Abigail stepped forward, her composure unwavering despite Preston's insult. Furthermore, Mr. Commissioner, I believe you should examine who conducted the surveys Mr. Preston provided. The signature indicates they were performed by James Wilson, who happens to be Mr. Preston's brother-in-law and has no formal training in hydrological mapping. The commissioner's expression hardened as he turned to Preston. Is this true? Have you presented me with fraudulent surveys to initiate a false legal action? Preston's bluster collapsed under the direct accusation. There's been a misunderstanding, he stammered. I was given these documents in good faith by your brother-in-law, Abigail finished, who coincidentally created them just days before our cattle drive, when an injunction would cause maximum damage to our operation. The commissioner gathered his papers with an air of finality. Mr. Preston, falsifying surveys to manipulate territorial water rights is a serious offense. I'll be reporting this incident to the governor's office. As the commissioner departed, Preston turned to Jackson and Abigail, his expression venomous. This isn't finished, Montgomery. There are other ways to acquire what I want. Be careful with threats, Victor, Jackson replied evenly. The territory has laws against attempted fraud as well as water rights violations. After Preston stormed out, Emmett approached his son and daughter-in-law, an unfamiliar expression on his weathered face. Respect, tinged with something like pride. Well handled, he said simply. Both of you. It was perhaps the highest praise he had ever offered, and its significance wasn't lost on either of them. That evening, after the household had settled following the day's drama, Jackson found Abigail on the veranda, gazing at the stars emerging in the darkening sky. You were remarkable today, he said, joining her at the railing. Few people have ever bested Victor Preston in a battle of wits and evidence. Abigail smiled slightly. My father always said that knowledge properly applied was more powerful than money or influence. He made sure I had the knowledge. The application was up to me. They stood in companionable silence for a moment, the events of the day settling around them. Preston mentioned my father's debts, Jackson said finally. Debts I hadn't disclosed to you. Abigail turned to face him. I assumed as much. The drought last year would have created significant financial strain even before the northern pastures began failing. You're not angry that I kept that from you? She considered his question carefully. I understand why you might have. Pride, perhaps, or not wanting to appear as though the Montgomery Empire had weaknesses. She paused. But partnerships thrive on honesty, Jackson, even difficult truths. You're right, he acknowledged. And I find I want our partnership to be more than just a business arrangement, Abigail. The directness of his statement hung in the evening air between them. Abigail felt her heart quicken, but years of guarding herself against disappointment made her hesitate. What exactly are you saying? Jackson moved closer, his expression earnest in the fading light. I'm saying that what began as my father's strategic solution to a water crisis has become the most fortunate turn in my life. I'm saying that working beside you these past months, seeing your intelligence, your determination, your unwavering dignity in the face of prejudice and challenges has changed how I see everything. He took her hands in his, a gesture of surprising tenderness from a man accustomed to commanding rather than connecting. I'm saying that I've come to care for you, Abigail, not for your water rights or your business acumen, though I value those tremendously, but for who you are. Abigail searched his face for any sign of insincerity or pity and found only genuine emotion. Still, years of defining herself by her limitations made her cautious. Jackson, I'm still the same woman who limps when she walks, who faces whispers, and stares in town, who doesn't fit the image of what a cattle baron's wife should be. No, he said firmly. You're not the same woman I married months ago, you're more. You've shown everyone, including me, that true worth isn't measured by how smoothly one walks, but by how steadfastly one stands for what matters. He reached, up to touch her face gently. And I'm not the same man who reluctantly agreed to my father's arranged marriage. I'm someone who now understands that the greatest fortune in my life walked through the door on that first day we met, though I was too blind to see it then. Tears pricked at Abigail's eyes, not of sorrow but of release, as if a weight she had carried for so long was finally being lifted. I never expected this, she confessed. I thought at best we might develop mutual respect and a functional partnership. I never dared hope for more, because you believed your limp defined what you could expect from life, Jackson said softly, just as I believed that marriage could only be a business decision, never a matter of the heart. And now, Abigail asked, her voice barely above, a whisper. Now I find myself in love with my wife, Jackson said simply, and hoping beyond reason that she might come to love me too, in time. In that moment, on the veranda of what had become truly their home, Abigail made her choice. Slowly, deliberately, she closed the distance between them and placed her hand against his cheek. Not in time, she said softly. Now. The kiss that followed was gentle, tentative, not the passionate embrace of storybook lovers, but the careful, wondering connection of two people discovering unexpected joy after believing it forever beyond their reach. When they parted, something had transformed between them. The business-like marriage of convenience had become a true bond, fraught with complexity, but rich with possibility. The cattle drive to Casper proceeded without incident the following week. Under Jackson and Abigail's joint management, the herd arrived in peak condition, fetching prices that exceeded even Emmett's ambitious expectations. The proceeds not only cleared the remaining Montgomery debts, but provided capital for further improvements to their combined operation. More significant than the financial success, however, was the transformation within the Montgomery household. Emmett, observing the genuine partnership that had developed between his son and daughter-in-law, gradually ceded more control of the ranch operations to them, focusing instead on expanding their market connections in the eastern states. The locals of Silver Creek slowly adjusted to the unusual sight of Abigail Montgomery riding confidently beside her husband at cattlemen's meetings, contributing ideas that gradually changed ranching practices throughout the region. Her physical limitation, once the subject of whispers and pity, became merely one aspect of a woman widely respected for her intelligence and capability. Victor Preston's attempt to acquire the Montgomery ranch through manipulation ultimately backfired. The scandal of the falsified surveys damaged his standing in the community and led to investigations that revealed other questionable banking practices. By year's end, he had sold his interests in Silver Creek and departed for Denver, leaving behind a diminished legacy and a daughter who had to reassess her prospects in the marriage market. 1 year after their wedding day, Jackson and Abigail stood on the high ridge he had shown her the previous autumn. The ranch spread below them, transformed by their joint vision, new breeding stock strengthening the herds, innovative water management systems supporting expanded grazing lands, an operation that had become the model for the territory. A year ago today, I married a stranger because my father commanded it, Jackson said, his arm around Abigail's waist. Quite possibly the best thing Emmett Montgomery ever forced me to do. Abigail leaned against him, comfortable in a closeness that had grown naturally between them. A year ago, I accepted that marriage would be a business partnership, the best outcome I could hope for with my limitations. Jackson turned her gently to face him. And now I understand that what I once saw as limitations were merely circumstances, she replied, her eyes bright with contentment. The true limitations were the ones I placed on my own expectations. Perhaps that's true for both of us, Jackson said thoughtfully. I never expected to find a true partner in an arranged marriage, let alone... Love? Abigail finished, with a smile. Yes, he agreed, drawing her closer. The most unexpected outcome of my father's water crisis solution. As they stood together on the ridge, overlooking the empire they continued to build, Abigail reflected on the journey that had brought them here, from strangers bound by contract to partners united by genuine love, from a marked woman and a reluctant heir to two people who had discovered that the greatest wealth, like the hidden springs beneath the Wyoming prairie, often lies concealed beneath the surface, waiting for those brave enough to look beyond appearances to the true value beneath. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.